The King of Spain couldn't close his mouth. Not because he was shocked or surprised. Charles II physically couldn't bring his jaw shut. His tongue hung out constantly, drool running down his chin like a broken faucet. This wasn't some fairy tale curse or divine punishment. This was genetics gone catastrophically wrong. A royal bloodline so desperate to keep power in the family that they literally destroyed themselves from the inside out. Charles II should have been the pinnacle of European royalty. Instead, he became a walking monument to what happens when you treat your family tree like a family wreath. His Habsburg jaw jutted out so severely that his teeth couldn't meet. Eating required servants to mash his food into paste. Speaking meant wrestling with a tongue too large for his mouth, turning royal decrees into barely comprehensible grunts. Court physicians counted his seizures like clockwork. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about meeting a king who seemed more corpse than monarch. The man who should have commanded the Spanish Empire, which stretched from the Americas to the Philippines, couldn't even command his own body. He didn't walk until he was almost 9 years old. Reading remained forever beyond his grasp. When he tried to rule, advisors had to repeat simple concepts over and over, watching his vacant eyes for any spark of understanding that rarely came. But Charles wasn't born in isolation. He was the inevitable result of 3 centuries of Habsburgs marrying Habsburgs. Uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin, sometimes even closer. Each marriage was a political calculation, keeping thrones and territories within the family. Each child born from these unions carried more and more damaged genes, like a biological time bomb ticking toward disaster. The Habsburgs didn't start out as genetic disasters. When Rudolf I grabbed the imperial crown in 1273, he wasn't thinking about chromosomes or hereditary illness. He was thinking about power, pure and simple. The family came from a modest castle in Switzerland, but Rudolf had ambitions that would reshape European history. See, medieval Europe wasn't like modern nation-states with clear borders and unified governments. Power was personal. It flowed through bloodlines, sealed with marriage contracts and legitimized by papal blessings. The Habsburgs understood this game better than anyone. They turned marriage into a weapon more devastating than any army. Their motto should tell you everything. Let others wage war. You happy Austria marry. While other dynasties exhausted themselves in endless battles, the Habsburgs were busy arranging weddings. They collected crowns like some people collect stamps, but instead of an album, they used a family tree that would eventually strangle itself. The masterstroke came in 1496, when Philip the Handsome married Joanna of Castile. This wasn't just another royal wedding with fancy clothes and expensive feasts. This union handed the Habsburgs control over Spain and its emerging global empire. One marriage ceremony gave them more territory than a dozen military campaigns. Their son Charles V inherited it all: Spain, the Netherlands, chunks of Italy, Austria, and technically the authority over the Holy Roman Empire. He ruled over more European territory than anyone since Charlemagne. The sun literally never set on his dominions, but hidden in this triumph was the seed of the family's destruction. When you control that much power, that much wealth, that many kingdoms, the absolute last thing you want is for any of it to leave the family. The Habsburgs looked at their massive inheritance and made a fateful decision. Rather than spreading their genetic lottery tickets around Europe through diverse marriages, they would keep everything in-house. The logic seemed flawless at the time. Every marriage outside the family meant potentially losing a throne to another dynasty. If your daughter married a French prince, her children might one day claim Habsburg lands for France. If your son wed an English princess, you'd have to share power with those upstart Tudors. But if your daughter married her first cousin, or better yet her uncle, the power stayed exactly where it belonged. Charles V himself kicked off this genetic Russian roulette by marrying his first cousin, Isabella of Portugal. Their son Philip II decided to up the ante. When Philip needed to secure the Portuguese throne, he married his niece, Anna of Austria. Not content with that level of inbreeding, he later married another niece, because apparently one wasn't enough. Each generation doubled down on this strategy. The Spanish branch married into the Austrian branch, then back into the Spanish branch, creating a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a Celtic knot. They weren't preserving royal blood. They were creating a genetic bottleneck that would strangle their entire dynasty. The irony is crushing. The very strategy meant to preserve Habsburg power became the poison that killed it. Those marriage contracts that once built an empire became death certificates for the bloodline. What started as political calculation ended as biological catastrophe. Palace genealogists actually had a term for it: reinforcing the blood. They thought they were making the royal lineage stronger, like forging steel. Instead, they were accumulating genetic mutations like compound interest on a loan from hell. Each marriage between cousins meant their children shared more DNA than they should. Each uncle-niece union pushed the boundaries of biological sustainability. By the time Charles II's parents married, the damage was already carved into their chromosomes. Philip IV and Mariana of Austria were uncle and niece, but that barely scratches the surface of their genetic entanglement. Thanks to generations of intermarriage, they were related in multiple ways. Mariana was simultaneously Philip's niece and his first cousin once removed. Their family tree had so many loops and connections that geneticists need specialized software just to map it out. The Habsburgs had turned natural selection on its head. Instead of the fittest surviving and reproducing, they ensured the same damaged genes kept copying themselves over and over. Recessive disorders that should have been rare became guarantees. The very blood they were so desperate to keep pure became their curse. You look at portraits of European royalty and you see it immediately. That grotesque jutting jaw, the mouth that couldn't close, the tongue that hung out like a dying animal's. The Habsburg jaw wasn't some minor family resemblance passed down through generations. This was a deformity so severe it turned eating into torture and speaking into an impossible struggle. The medical term is mandibular prognathism, but the Habsburgs didn't need fancy words to know something was desperately wrong. Their lower jaws grew so far beyond their upper jaws that their teeth couldn't meet. We're talking about a gap so wide you could slide your fingers between their upper and lower teeth when their mouths were closed. Philip IV of Spain had it bad. His jaw protruded so dramatically that court painters had to find creative angles to make him look even remotely normal in portraits. But compared to what was coming, Philip looked like a classical Greek statue. Each generation, the jaw grew worse. Each marriage between cousins made the deformity more pronounced. By the time you get to the later Habsburgs, eating solid food became nearly impossible. They couldn't chew. Food would fall out of their mouths. Royal dinners turned into grotesque displays of human suffering disguised as luxury. The worst part, this wasn't their only problem. The same genetic disaster that warped their jaws also elongated their faces, swelled their lower lips, and created what contemporaries described as the look of idiocy. Court observers wrote about Habsburg princes whose mouths hung permanently open, saliva dripping constantly because they physically couldn't close their lips. These weren't peasants suffering in obscurity. These were the most powerful people in Europe, unable to perform the basic human function of closing their mouths. Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, had a jaw so deformed that foreign ambassadors could barely hide their shock when meeting him. One French diplomat wrote that Leopold's appearance was so strange that one must make an effort not to laugh. Another described how the emperor's speech was so garbled by his deformity that only his closest servants could understand him. This was the man negotiating treaties, declaring wars, deciding the fate of millions. The progression was relentless. What started as a slightly prominent chin in early generations became a monstrous deformity by the 1600s. Maximilian I had a noticeable underbite. His great-great-grandson Charles V couldn't close his mouth properly. Fast forward a few more generations and you have jaws so grotesquely extended that the lower teeth sat completely in front of the upper teeth, creating a reverse bite that made every meal an ordeal. The Spanish branch had it worst of all. Their portraits tell the story better than any description. Faces that look barely human, jaws that seem to belong to a different species entirely. These weren't birth defects that could be corrected. This was what happened when you turned your family tree into a family wreath, when every marriage was between blood relatives, when keeping power mattered more than keeping your children healthy. On November 6, 1661, the Spanish royal court held its breath as Queen Mariana of Austria went into labor. The child she carried represented the future of the Spanish Empire, but everyone in that birthing chamber knew the truth. This baby was doomed before his first breath. Charles's parents weren't just relatives, they were uncle and niece. His family tree was so tangled it looked more like a spider web. Where normal people have 32 great-great-great-grandparents, Charles had 10. His genetic makeup was a catastrophe waiting to happen, and happen it did. The infant that emerged was so sickly that the royal physicians immediately began preparing last rites. His head was grotesquely swollen with fluid. His jaw already showed signs of the family curse, protruding unnaturally even in infancy. But the physical deformities were just the beginning. This child couldn't hold his head up. He didn't respond to sounds. When they tried to feed him, the milk dribbled out of his malformed mouth. The court tried to hide the severity of his condition. Official announcements spoke of a delicate constitution, but palace servants whispered about the monster child who shouldn't have survived his first night. Somehow, against all medical logic, he lived. The Spanish Empire's heir was a genetic disaster wrapped in royal silks. As months passed, the situation grew more alarming. Charles didn't reach developmental milestones. At an age when royal children were learning to walk, Charles couldn't sit upright without support. His nurses reported that he drooled constantly, his oversized tongue hanging from his mouth like a slab of meat. When he finally attempted speech at age 4, the sounds that emerged were incomprehensible gurgles. The royal doctors documented everything. His medical records, preserved in Spanish archives, read like a catalog of human suffering. Constant fevers, seizures that left him rigid and blue-lipped, digestive problems so severe he vomited after every meal. His bones were soft, bending under his own weight. Walking became impossible until age 8, and even then he moved like a broken marionette. Philip IV, Charles's father, watched his son's struggles with growing horror. This wasn't just about having a disabled heir. This was about the survival of the Spanish Habsburg line. Charles was the only surviving male heir. His older brother had died, another victim of the family's poisoned genetics. The king ordered the best physicians in Europe to examine the prince, but they all reached the same conclusion. This child was barely viable as a human being, let alone as a future king. The Queen Mother tried everything: prayers, relics, holy water baths. She brought in miracle workers who claimed they could cure the prince. Nothing worked. Charles remained what palace insiders privately called El Hechizado, the bewitched one, not because of any curse, but because his very existence seemed to defy nature. By age 10, court observers described a child who looked like a caricature of Habsburg deformity. His jaw had grown so pronounced he couldn't close his mouth. His tongue, too large for his mouth, lolled out constantly. His mental capacity remained that of a much younger child. This was Spain's future king, and everyone who saw him knew the empire was doomed. The throne of Spain required a king who could speak, who could command, who could at least feed himself without assistance. Charles II could do none of these things. His own court officials described a monarch so physically and mentally compromised that foreign ambassadors wondered if they were witnessing an elaborate joke. His daily life was a carefully orchestrated performance to hide the depth of his disabilities. Servants would prop him up in his throne, stuff cushions behind him to keep him upright. When foreign dignitaries arrived, they positioned him at specific angles to minimize the shocking appearance of his deformed jaw. But no amount of staging could hide the saliva that constantly dripped from his mouth or the vacant stare that suggested nobody was really home. The speech problem alone would have destroyed any normal person's ability to rule. Charles's words came out as wet, slurred sounds that even his most devoted servants struggled to interpret. Important state meetings became exercises in humiliation as ministers pretended to understand their king's unintelligible mumblings. One French ambassador wrote that conversing with Charles was like trying to understand a drowning man with his mouth full of porridge. Then came the theories. In an age before genetic science, people needed explanations for why their king was barely functional. The most popular theory: witchcraft. Palace gossipers claimed Charles had been cursed in the womb. Others believed he was possessed by demons. The nickname El Hechizado, the bewitched, stuck because it was easier to believe in supernatural causes than to admit the royal bloodline had destroyed itself through centuries of inbreeding. The sorcery rumors gained credibility when Charles began having fits. He would suddenly go rigid, foam at the mouth, and speak in what witnesses described as tongues. Modern medicine recognizes these as epileptic seizures, but 17th century Spaniards saw demonic possession. The royal confessors brought in exorcists. Priests chanted over the king while he convulsed on the floor. Holy water was thrown. Crucifixes were waved. Nothing helped because you can't exorcise genetics. His inability to produce an heir fueled even wilder speculations. Charles married twice, but both marriages remained childless. Court physicians delicately suggested the king was impotent, but conspiracy theorists preferred more colorful explanations. Some claimed he'd been cursed to be the last of his line. Others whispered about deals with the devil that had gone wrong. The truth was simpler and sadder. His body was too damaged to function properly in any capacity. Daily governance became impossible. Charles would sign whatever documents his advisors put in front of him, often without understanding their contents. He'd fall asleep during council meetings, drooling onto state papers. When he was awake, his mental capacity prevented him from grasping complex political matters. Spain, once Europe's superpower, was being ruled by a man who needed help cutting his own food. The most heartbreaking accounts come from servants who actually cared for him. They describe, "The numbers don't lie," and they paint a portrait of genetic catastrophe that would make any scientist gasp. Charles II's family tree wasn't a tree at all. It was a wreath, looping back on itself with mathematical precision. Modern geneticists have calculated his inbreeding coefficient at 0.254. For context, the offspring of siblings typically score around 0.25. Charles managed to exceed even that biological taboo through generations of uncle-niece and first-cousin marriages stacking upon each other like a house of cards built from DNA. You know how people joke about keeping it in the family? The Habsburgs turned that into state policy. 8 of Charles's great-great-grandparents were descendants of Joanna and Philip I of Castile. That's not heritage. That's copying and pasting the same genetic material until the errors compound into disaster. Scientists today understand that this level of consanguinity doesn't just increase the risk of recessive disorders, it guarantees them. The genetic lottery Charles played had no winning numbers. Every harmful recessive gene hiding in the Habsburg bloodline had multiple chances to pair up and express itself. We're talking about homozygosity levels that would alarm a lab studying fruit flies, let alone a human being expected to rule an empire. His genome carried the accumulated weight of 16 generations of strategic inbreeding, each marriage adding another layer of genetic risk. What fascinates researchers most is how his condition represents a perfect storm of genetic mishaps. The famous Habsburg jaw, that's just the visible tip of an iceberg, made entirely of damaged chromosomes. Modern analysis suggests Charles likely suffered from at least 2 different genetic disorders working in concert, possibly including distal renal tubular acidosis combined with combined pituitary hormone deficiency. These aren't conditions you'd wish on anyone, much less someone expected to make decisions affecting millions of lives. The truly haunting part comes when geneticists map out what happened at the cellular level. Every cell in Charles's body carried this burden of duplicated genetic material. His DNA was essentially having a conversation with itself, echoing the same flaws back and forth with no fresh genetic material to mask the defects. Studies of other Habsburg portraits suggest the jaw deformity alone increased by 700% over just 200 years of inbreeding. Charles represented the mathematical endpoint of this progression. Laboratory analysis of Habsburg genealogy reveals something that contemporary physicians could never have understood. Charles was more genetically similar to himself than most people are to their own parents. His mother and father shared so much DNA that conceiving Charles was like shuffling a half deck of cards and expecting a full hand. The miracle isn't that he suffered from so many ailments, it's that he survived to adulthood at all. Poor Charles never stood a chance at normal governance. While other monarchs worried about foreign invasions or economic policy, Charles couldn't even chew solid food without assistance. Contemporary accounts describe a king who spent most council meetings in a fog of confusion, nodding along to whatever his advisors suggested because following complex political discussions exceeded his cognitive capacity. Spain wasn't ruled by a king during these years. It was ruled by whoever could get closest to the royal bedchamber. The power vacuum surrounding Charles created a feeding frenzy among European nobility that would embarrass vultures. His mother, Mariana of Austria, clung to her position as regent long past when Charles technically came of age, correctly recognizing that her son couldn't govern a sandbox, let alone an empire. She battled against Charles's illegitimate half-brother, John Joseph of Austria, in a power struggle that paralyzed Spanish governance for years. Meanwhile, the actual king spent his days being spoon-fed specially prepared mush and trying to understand why God had cursed him so thoroughly. Foreign ambassadors wrote home with barely concealed shock at the Spanish court's dysfunction. The French envoy reported that Charles would sign any document placed before him, often without reading or understanding its contents. The papal nuncio described council meetings where the king would suddenly begin crying or laughing inappropriately, forcing officials to adjourn until his fits passed. These weren't the actions of a tyrant or incompetent ruler. They were the behaviors of a severely disabled man trapped in a role his genetics made impossible to fulfill. Spain's economy during Charles's reign tells its own story of collapse. Tax collection became sporadic as regional governors realized the crown lacked any capacity to enforce its will. The Spanish military, once Europe's most feared force, deteriorated into bands of unpaid soldiers more likely to raid their own countryside than defend it. Trade routes that had poured gold from the Americas into Spanish coffers fell under the control of pirates and rival nations who correctly assessed that Spain couldn't mount an effective response. The court itself descended into something resembling a particularly dark comedy. Nobles fought over who would have the honor of helping the king to the bathroom or cutting his food into manageable pieces. These weren't ceremonial positions anymore. They were practical necessities for a monarch who couldn't perform basic self-care. The gentleman of the bedchamber went from prestigious title to medical orderly. Foreign diplomats learned that the path to Spanish cooperation ran through bribing the servants who controlled access to Charles during his brief lucid periods. What makes this political disaster truly tragic is that everyone involved understood the situation's hopelessness. Charles himself reportedly begged God to grant him death, aware enough of his limitations to suffer from them but powerless to overcome his biology. His courtiers played elaborate charades, pretending the empire functioned normally while privately scrambling to secure their own positions before the inevitable collapse. Spain had become a zombie empire, shambling forward on institutional momentum while its head of state could barely remain conscious through a full meal. Europe held its breath for 35 years, waiting for Charles II to die, not out of cruelty, out of necessity. Every chancellor and king from London to Vienna understood that Charles's death would trigger a succession crisis that would reshape the continent. He had no children, could never have children, and his will became the most anticipated document in European history. Diplomats spent decades negotiating secret treaties about what would happen when, not if, Charles died without an heir. The waiting game turned into elaborate political theater. Charles, in his few coherent moments, changed his will multiple times, naming different heirs as various factions gained influence over him. First, he favored his nephew Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. When the boy died suddenly, Charles named Philip of Anjou, grandson of his sister, and Louis XIV of France. Then, under pressure from his Austrian relatives, he considered Archduke Charles of Austria. Each change sent shockwaves through European courts, as alliances shifted based on who might inherit the Spanish Empire. When Charles finally died on November 1, 1700, his last will favoring Philip of Anjou lit a fuse that had been laid across Europe for decades. France suddenly stood to gain the entire Spanish Empire, creating a superpower that would dwarf all rivals. Austria, England, and the Dutch Republic collectively decided this was unacceptable. What followed was 13 years of warfare that killed over 400,000 people and redrew the map of Europe. The War of the Spanish Succession wasn't just about throne rights. It was about preventing any single power from dominating Europe. Battles raged from the Netherlands to Italy, from Portugal to Bavaria. The English Duke of Marlborough won stunning victories at Blenheim and Ramillies. Prince Eugene of Savoy carved through French armies in Italy. Meanwhile, Spain itself became a battlefield as competing claimants fought village by village for control. The human cost extended far beyond battlefield casualties. Entire regions were depopulated as armies requisitioned food and supplies. Trade collapsed as merchant ships were pressed into military service. Cities that had prospered for centuries found themselves under siege, their populations starving while diplomats argued over succession rights. All because one man's genetics made him incapable of producing an heir. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 finally ended the bloodshed, but at a price that would have horrified the Habsburgs who started their inbreeding program. Spain kept its independence but lost its European territories. The Spanish Netherlands went to Austria. Sicily went to Savoy. Gibraltar and Minorca went to Britain. The Spanish Empire was carved up like a Christmas turkey, all because centuries of keeping it in the family had produced a king too genetically damaged to father children. The bitter irony: the Habsburgs' obsession with bloodline purity designed to preserve their power ultimately destroyed it. Every strategic marriage between cousins, every uncle wedding his niece to keep territories united, had added another stone to an avalanche that finally buried their dynasty. Charles II's broken body became the instrument that shattered an empire, proving that in genetics as in politics, diversity isn't just valuable, it's essential for survival. The story of Charles II got twisted beyond recognition almost the moment he died. Court gossips claimed demons visited his bedchamber. Priests whispered about divine punishment. Foreign ambassadors wrote home about exorcisms performed in the dead of night to free the king from Satan's grip. None of it was true. Here's what really happened. The French ambassador, desperate to explain why Spain's king couldn't even chew his own food, started spreading stories about witchcraft. Palace servants, terrified of being blamed for the king's deteriorating condition, jumped on the supernatural bandwagon. Soon everyone from kitchen maids to court physicians was seeing signs of demonic possession in what we now know were simply symptoms of severe genetic disorders. The exorcism stories, complete fabrication. Yes, priests prayed over Charles constantly, but that's because 17th century Spain prayed over everything from stubbed toes to stillborn calves. The supposed midnight rituals where holy water supposedly made the king convulse? Those convulsions were epileptic seizures, documented in medical reports that conveniently got ignored by storytellers hungry for drama. Even more ridiculous were the claims about Charles being mentally vacant, a drooling puppet controlled by his advisors. Court records paint a different picture. The man signed state documents. He participated in council meetings. His handwriting was shaky, sure, but the content of his letters shows a functioning mind trapped in a body that refused to cooperate. One particularly revealing letter to his sister describes his frustration at being unable to pronounce certain words, hardly the ramblings of a madman. The curse narrative served everyone's interests except the truth. The nobility used it to explain away their own incompetence. Why blame bad governance when you could blame the devil? Foreign powers loved it because a cursed king made Spain look weak and ripe for conquest. The church embraced it because fighting demons meant more donations and influence. Modern pop culture made things worse. Television shows portray Charles as a grotesque monster lurching through palace halls, servants fleeing in terror. Movies show him as a babbling lunatic kept in chains. Video games feature him as a literal zombie king. Each retelling adds another layer of fiction until the real man disappears completely. The truth was both simpler and sadder. Charles II wasn't cursed by witches or punished by God. He was poisoned by his own bloodline. Generation after generation of aunts marrying nephews, cousins wedding cousins, until the family tree looked more like a family wreath. His suffering came from DNA so scrambled that modern geneticists calculate his inbreeding coefficient at 0.25425 higher than the children of siblings. Every twitch interpreted as demonic possession was likely a neurological misfire. Every moment of confusion blamed on evil spirits was probably the result of hydrocephalus pressing on his brain. The famous Habsburg jaw that made eating torture, that came from centuries of selective inbreeding, not supernatural intervention. Charles II died on November 1, 1700, and with him died the Spanish Habsburg line. His autopsy report reads like a medical horror story, a body that barely functioned, organs that had given up, a genetic disaster centuries in the making. The physician who performed it noted the king's brain contained almost no fluid, his heart was the size of a peppercorn, and his blood was thin as water. But Charles understood what was coming. In his final months, he worked frantically to prevent the coming chaos. He named Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, as his heir, knowing full well this would trigger a continental war. Some called it madness. Others saw clarity. Charles knew Spain needed fresh blood, literally and figuratively. The Habsburgs had to end. The decision sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, 13 years of bloodshed that redrew the map of Europe. France and Spain united under Bourbon rule. Austria grabbed the Netherlands. Britain took Gibraltar. Hundreds of thousands died because one family couldn't stop marrying itself into extinction. The irony cuts deep. The Habsburgs built their empire on strategic marriages, using weddings as weapons of conquest. They ended it the same way, except the conquest was against their own genetic code. Every union meant to preserve power instead diluted it, until the mightiest dynasty in Europe couldn't produce a single healthy heir. Charles's death marked more than the end of a dynasty. It shattered the medieval concept of bloodline purity. Other royal families took note. Cousin marriages became less common. The idea that royal blood was somehow special, that it needed protection from common contamination, began its slow death spiral. The Habsburgs had proven, in the most horrific way possible, that pure blood was poison blood. Walk through the Prado Museum in Madrid, and you'll see the portraits. Generation after generation of that distinctive jaw, growing more pronounced with each canvas. The artists tried to flatter, to minimize, but even they couldn't hide the truth. By the time you reach Charles II's portrait, the deformity dominates the entire composition. The painter Carreño de Miranda didn't need to exaggerate. Reality was disturbing enough. Spain never fully recovered from the Habsburg collapse. The empire that once ruled half the world shrank to a shadow. The gold that flowed from the Americas couldn't cure genetic rot. All the prayers, all the exorcisms, all the desperate diplomatic marriages meant nothing when the royal bloodline itself turned toxic. The last Spanish Habsburg died choking on his own tongue, unable to swallow, his body a monument to centuries of genetic gambling where the house always won. No curse needed, no demons required, just generation after generation of powerful people who loved their bloodline to